Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, thanks. I'm Bonnie Dorsey, and I am with CCFM staff. I'm going to be passing around a sign-in sheet. Please sign in on the sheet. If you need AIA credits, list your AIA number and make sure your email is legible. If you do not need the credits, we still need you to sign in, and we will provide a certificate of attendance if you check that box on the sheet. Okay. To stay on track today with our busy day, I'm going to give you a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning. And if you would please save all questions till the end, if time allows, we will be able to answer them. But because credit hours, we have to make sure a lot of information is covered. Okay. So welcome to our session, COV2503, Master Planning and the Art of Consensus Building. This is a 90-minute session that is certified with AIA for 1.5 learning units, HSW, Health, Safety, and Wellness. Our speaker is David Kuhlman, and Fernando Alessandrini will be assisting a little as well. David is an architect with JNKA Architects and a longtime member of CCFM, and we welcome him to present to you today on consensus building. This session is sponsored by Whiting Turner. We'd like to thank them for their sponsorship. David, you can take it away.
Yeah, hello everyone. Does that sound okay? Okay. Thank you. This is an honor to be with you this morning. On a very personal note, I grew up in the Archdiocese, or in the Diocese of Covington, so I'm 10 minutes from where I grew up. And with our specialization in serving churches, we barely survived COVID. As you can imagine, and you all probably have very similar stories of seeing architects and working with architects and even your own challenges at the diocesan level. But last year at the conference in Nashville, I told Mary, it's like, I'm so thankful. This is an act of thanksgiving that we survived, and we've gotten very busy since then. So I'm glad to be here to talk about our work, and especially our master planning process, which I'll obviously talk a lot about. Yes, as my bio says, I'm very passionate about working with churches and beauty as a form of evangelization. And as architects, that's the best way we can evangelize outside of just our personal evangelization in the Catholic Church and beyond. But we really firmly believe that our facilities can be forms of evangelization as well, especially the churches, but all the buildings. And good stewardship of those buildings reflects beauty. And so really that's what everything we do is about. And that all starts, in our case, with a master planning process that I'll go into with great depth. To get the AIA accredited, I had to kind of add a lot of things so this could be accredited. So I'll just dive in as we speak. I believe you all read this. I won't read it word for word. It's in the program, but I just kind of summarized it there. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot of slides and a lot of projects, and I hope it's helpful for you. One thing I want to emphasize is we believe a successful master planning process is very collaborative, not just with us and you or the building committee we're working with, but the building committees at each parish is obviously the core, but the different ministry teams at the parishes, we really try to involve. Again, this is all about building consensus. And part of building consensus is involving as many groups and stakeholders at the church or parish or school level as possible. So that's something we've been striving to do for many years. In our process, we've been doing master planning for Catholic churches for 33 years. And our firm is 62 years old, but it's continuing to evolve, and it's catered towards each client specifically. But the presentation I'm giving to you is kind of an overall summary of some of the consistencies of each master planning process. And this list is of all the different people and entities we try to involve is really pivotal for us in building that consensus. Even including the parish maintenance staff and their history of knowledge of the buildings. But even the team that we tend to bring, depending on the extent of the master plan, some do require involvement of assessment consultants and engineering consultants, material scientists, artisans, and then the cost estimating consultants, so that everything we're giving estimates for is accurate as possible. But also even the broader parish community and then yourselves, the diocesan representatives, is sometimes overlooked. But we always have to remind our parishes that, hey, the archdiocese or the diocese owns these buildings, so they have to be part of this process. And sometimes we find that they try to avoid that and do projects without the diocesan overview. This, about 10 years ago, we've been giving this presentation for many years, as I mentioned, but internally we kind of decided what's the simplest way we can summarize it and how we do this process. And this is what we came up with, kind of a three-part process: discovery and definition, design and dialogue, and pricing and presentation. So I've kind of color-coded my whole presentation accordingly, but these are kind of the three primary steps of our process. And even other architects that I've seen copies of presentations are very similar. They use different terminology, but this is kind of the terminology we came up with. And I'll just start with the first, part 1A, we call it, the discovery phase. And that's really the assessing of the existing conditions, not only the physical conditions, but also some of the challenges that the parishes or schools or the client has, including circulation problems. But I'll start here with kind of more on the health, safety, and welfare, the actual facility assessment and reserve studies. We have a number of ways we've done this as well. We do them ourselves, but in some cases, if it's a large campus or if we feel like our team isn't necessarily the right team to do it, we have assessment consultants. And one of these is that I think might have been, we'll see it a little bit later here. But anyway, so these are some of the documents from some of these assessments. And we even start with a questionnaire that before we even start the assessment about the history of the buildings and any data they might have. And we have a questionnaire about handicap accessibility. And these are just some of those highlights without going into the detail. But the reserve study or facility assessments evaluating all the existing conditions, interior, exterior, and then especially regarding life safety and handicap accessibility. So thorough walkthroughs with ourselves and any engineers that might be involved. I know there's another talk that's going on right now that's specific to that, but this is kind of a quick overview because it's a key part of a master plan, is that the worst thing we want to do is master plan for improvements that disregard any of the maintenance issues and leaks in the building. And we've seen that over the years where buildings have been beautified, but they didn't repair the roof leaks. So the new paint, the decorative painting in the church is being damaged because they didn't do a facility assessment to start with. So just, and some of these images, this is all from the Cathedral of Indianapolis. We did a 8-month master planning process, long range. And these are some of the specific zoomed in photos that, in this case, an assessment consultant did with us, and even highlighting some of the health, safety, and welfare issues of exposed conduit and exposed cloth wiring, things that really need to be addressed and included in the cost estimating. But also having artisans look at the stained glass windows and things like kitchens, non-code compliant, hoods in the kitchens is a very common thing we find. And then, of course, all the masonry and roofing conditions that are letting water into the buildings. And then with our engineers, they do their own specific assessments of all the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. And we go up on the roofs. And just basically, we got to cover as thoroughly as we can with what we see, the conditions of the building. So all of that we're informed about that as we start the design process. And then regarding specifically handicap accessibility, some of the things that aren't necessarily upfront or given to us as goals, we recognize as we start these master plans or schematic designs that might be challenges. And this is one specific project with Brother John over here at the Dominican Priory in St. Louis that we're currently working on. And this is one of the challenges we have is they have an handicap accessible entry, but it's not the main entry. So they have an elevator here that was added, but their main entrance that most people come to for the first time still has these grand steps. So how do we navigate that? And how do we address that? And there's even steps halfway up this main corridor to the chapel, where most people go. So that was, we had a lot of discussion about that, but it was those initial walkthroughs where we noticed those things and had to point these things out and discuss them before we even started the design process. And this picture up the upper right is an example of a bottleneck condition that a particular client wanted us to, they weren't sure what to do, but we had to go observe it in person. So we tried to go to liturgies or services. This is a Protestant church in this case, but this is right after one of their services. People are coming in and people are coming out, and they didn't have handicap accessibility with this grand stairway here. So we had to find a way to solve this design-wise, this bottleneck, but also the handicap access. So seeing those in person just brought it to life for us and really showed us what a big problem it was. And then just the more thorough evaluation, this specifically regarding ADA accessibility, looking at the elevators, evaluating them, assessing their conditions, even the elevator machine rooms. And this, once again, is an assessment consultant had these forms that they use to do those assessments. And in some cases, we do kind of quick feasibility and structural studies as part of the assessments to just see, is it possible, before we start design, to consider spaces. In this case, this is the lower level below the Cathedral of Indianapolis. Could it be used as, or converted to a gathering space? Is there enough headroom? Could we excavate deeper to give it enough headroom? And we brought a structural engineer to look at it and do a feasibility study, and they evaluated that no, you could not. It was not feasible. There was too many obstacles structurally and challenges, but it at least ruled it out, because if people ever asked, did you ever study that? Yes, we did. We did our due diligence, and it's not an option. So we had to find other ways to provide this large gathering space for the Cathedral of Indianapolis. And then, of course, all of those assessments, one of the key parts is a 10 to 20 year plan for how much money does the parish or diocese have to raise over time to pay off and take care of those long-term maintenance items. In this case, at the Cathedral of Indianapolis, it was close to $5 million of work over a 20-year period. So long range, but significant deferred maintenance. So that we had to keep that in mind as we designed the long-range master plan. And this is one for a high school that we did near our office in Chicago. And this is Bureau Veritas, is the consultant I was referring to, that does national facility assessments. And what's unique about them is they have an online system. So all of their facility assessment goes to an app that facility managers like yourselves can use, or the parishes themselves, to update as they do work, and they can keep it all, but it's all online in a system that we found really, with current technologies, really made a lot of sense, as opposed to just the bound assessments that we're typically issuing at the end of the process. Okay, so that's the discovery part of part one. So now we're in the definition phase, where it's really working with all the user groups and the building committee. And again, this is where the consensus building really starts in our process, with all the questionnaires and meetings face-to-face. So distributing hard copies, but also issuing digital copies. Sometimes we do the Google Docs polls to get, for people that aren't comfortable coming in person, it's much easier to get information from them and feedback digitally. So we used all of these methods at the Cathedral of Indianapolis's master plan. And gosh, we had just so much information that we had to decipher and go through and summarize. But it was just really key to building that consensus. Everything from conference calls to user groups of 6 to 8 people to town hall meetings in some cases for various projects. We'll do even a town hall at the beginning before we start the design. So really, it's really different for every client that we serve, depending on what the specific goals are. And just some images of our questionnaires and sit-down meetings we've had. And again, sometimes these are put on the websites, sometimes they're mailed out, and then we get them all back by a certain date. And then but another thing we often do, in this case, this is a brand new church in the Kansas City, Kansas Archdiocese. We actually issued floor plans, kind of diagrammatic from other projects we've done, to get feedback on traditional layout of seating and traditional location of tabernacle and center, or slightly off center but prominent, just because they're kind of a unique parish that we're serving that's half Hispanic, half Caucasian. So the pastor really thought we needed to kind of put these questions out there visually more so than just a narrative. So we did one for the location of the baptismal font over here and got answers back. We got one for the location of the tabernacle and even the choir location, and got a lot of data and feedback from each of those. Even those aren't specific designs for their church. It just helped people to visualize, and it's easier for them to understand and therefore answer the question of our questionnaires. And then this is just an example of one of the actual questionnaires for that project. And then Fernando, being bilingual, because they had so many non-English speaking members of their parish, Fernando translated those documents. So we got a lot of things back in Spanish. And so having someone that can communicate with people that aren't necessarily strong in English has also been very helpful over the years. And Fernando, he can instantly translate as he hears to speaking, and so it's really been helpful for some of our church clients that have a high Hispanic population. And then after we get all that data, summarizing all that. And we do our best. It's always a big challenge. How do we succinctly summarize the highlights of all this information we're gathering? And these are just some of the summary examples of summaries. And then we do like little bubble diagrams that help us explain to the building committee or the diocesan committee what we've heard in terms of the feedback we're getting. And then we, in some cases, we do quantitative analysis. So highlighted are the number of comments specific to a certain response. Without going into it, just this is how we summarized all the data we got for that particular project. And then for the Cathedral of Indianapolis, we did it a little slightly different way. So it's really catered differently for each project. We don't kind of have a cookie cutter one way to do it. It's because each project is unique. We've kind of found how do we best summarize this specific project in a way that makes sense. And then we also then summarize in some of the diagrams before we met with the building committee what we heard, and we kind of point out what the preference was. In this case, with all the data we got, the preference was for radial seating as opposed to straight pews, and a choir loft, but a secondary choir space down next to the sanctuary because they have a Hispanic choir with contemporary instruments, but they have a traditional choir that prefers to be in the loft up at the back of the church. And then tabernacle location in the center, and then the baptistry, obviously, at the back, at the entrance. So that was kind of the summary of the most, comments that we received. And then ultimately that led to helping us efficiently design the new church. And then we've also done these photographic summaries, overlays, little bubble diagrams that, in this case, a girls' Catholic high school, including handicap accessibility and just bringing an old building up to current codes. Life safety and handicap accessibility was one of the highest priorities in this case. And then we even did a floor plan summary for them to get and all of these diagrams are really to get that core building committee's approval before we start design, that this is what we heard, and is this what you are giving us authorization to then start designing toward? And in some cases, they'll say, no, we ruled that out years ago. We know that we've studied that already. But it's basically us summarizing what we're hearing. It's very rare that we're overruled. Typically, they defer to what the data says. Because, again, if they want to build consensus, they've got to listen to all the groups as well of the parish or the school or whatever the group might be. Just a few more examples of just very simple bubble diagrams. These are digital sketches over just a floor plan, digital floor plan. And in this case, one of the things that was really a big problem was the handicap access. Just this terrible, very, very steep ramp right off their main corridor. So in addition to repurposing a lot of spaces, navigating that handicap accessibility was something that we really had to identify, right up front and confirm it was a high priority from all the information we received through the visioning process. And then this is a summary for the Cathedral of Indianapolis. There were some major changes there of ultimately demolishing this old, beautiful rectory building that just had so much deferred maintenance needs, as beautiful as it was, but it also hides the cathedral from visibility along this main route, north-south route through Indianapolis. So the idea of moving those building uses to an underutilized building and opening up that corner was one of the main ideas that came from the visioning process, and then moving these uses over to another building that's catty corner to the cathedral. And then all the narrative summaries here. And then this is just a site plan diagram that I did to summarize that new church in Kansas. So probably our earliest site plan. Their original civil engineer site plan for zoning had the church oriented just parallel to the school. And with all the feedback we got, this is just the idea that I came up with. It really wants to have a more prominent entrance that addresses the entry. And this was just a simple way to express that before we launched into schematic design. And then we also do, not all the time though, we don't always do a program specific to each space. I would say about 50%. You'd think in growing up, or I guess entering the profession, that was always kind of a given that you have a building program. But it's amazing how often that's pretty general. But in this particular project, we did have a very specific building program because it was a brand new building. So we had to really identify all the square footages of every space that was necessary. So that's the visioning and definition phase. And once the building committee or diocese approves that, then we get the go-ahead, basically, to develop, to do the design phase, the second step in our process. And then that's really where we go to the drawing board and start to develop our initial conceptual designs. So the part that architects are typically known to do, and we start to do, most of our projects, I still work by hand digitally on tablets, but most of the younger architects now, they're right on the computer pretty quickly, especially if we have a basic concept. And these are just examples of things we've done to prepare for those first design review meetings. So site plans, floor plans, and conceptual elevations. And these are scanned hand drawings in this case for a brand new church, the church in Kansas. And just little simple massing studies for how a new traditional Catholic church would relate to an existing school building. But we also typically develop multiple schemes. Again, to build consensus, we have to provide options so that there's, to give people just more, ideas to respond to. And we've just found we just can't come with one idea because, I think it's going to take longer if we just say, this is the design, how do you like it? Well, we just learned over the years that we've got to bring multiple schemes. In this case, the first design review meeting for the Cathedral of Indianapolis, I developed 6 schemes, which is a little excessive, but there were all these ideas that we got from the visioning process that we had to translate, if only to rule them out. But we felt like we owed them this range of ideas at that first meeting, considering the long-range goals of this project. And then we do just photographic overlay sketches. So just literally, this is a photograph, and this is just an overlay sketch I did just to get some ideas on paper of how do we even beautify the interior of the cathedral itself in simple ways, but bring back some of its original beauty that was lost in a renovation in the 1980s. And then in terms of, this is a church where handicap accessibility to the sanctuary was a significant issue, but kind of removing a very modern intervention after Vatican II and including this reredos wall in a traditional Gothic church that, in this case, they wanted to remove, and they wanted a reredos that was more in line with the original design of the church. And these are our initial sketches of that to get those ideas on paper and to start to address some of the accessibility needs and how that gets integrated with the design. And just another range of sketches, photographic overlays, floor plans, etc. Another one where handicap access was a major issue. They have steps right inside their vestibule and a step here. And how can we make this a handicap accessible lobby into their daily chapel? And this was just a conceptual idea at the very beginning. And then a full accessibility projects, in this case an elevator addition. So in some cases we go right to our a BIM program, Revit, because we had a very clear idea from a very simple sketch, and it was very floor plan driven, but at our first meeting this was what we presented, because it was simple enough that we could jump right into using Revit to develop this idea. And that's the elevator tower, of course. And then as concurrent with that, developing those initial concepts, we have to be sure, of course, as architects, we meet zoning, building code, but also the diocesan liturgical requirements and the USCCB built to living stone requirements, if it involves renovation of a church or a new church, et cetera. So that's kind of happening parallel, because the worst thing we want to do is show something that doesn't meet those requirements and then have to make changes down the road. So that's part of our process too, of course. Okay, so after we develop those concepts, again, focusing on consensus building, the design review meetings. And we typically propose at least 3 for a significant size master plan. In Indianapolis, we ended up having 4 over, I think it was 4 or 5 months, where it's back to the drawing boards with comments, come back again 3 or 4 weeks later. So it's a very collaborative with the building committee once again, and all focused on building consensus. So just examples, boy, this is a really old one from before I even joined the firm, of course, but back in the day of pinning up the drawings and vellums up on the walls to, obviously doing things online and using our laptops and presenting digitally. But basically using the tools, whatever the best technology that we can use to convey the ideas and get the feedback that we need. And at those meetings, we mark up our drawings. So these are literally some of my markups of feedback I was getting from the building committees. And just having dialogue with them and listening to ideas that different building committee members have. Again, all towards building consensus. And in the cathedral's case, there were pieces of different schemes that different people liked. This is just, my markup from that first meeting. And the final scheme ended up being parts of different schemes, of course. And in some cases, we do completely different stylistic designs. This addition was for a new facility, multi-purpose gymnasium, classroom, school, rectory, all in one building next to a beautiful historic church on the south side of Chicago. So my tendency was to do something design that related to the church, but the different committee members thought, no, this should be different. We want to draw people, the younger generations from the neighborhood. I think it should be modern. So we literally did 2 different design styles of the same floor plan. So the floor plan didn't change, it was just the style of the exterior, and then some design precedents in this case. And ultimately, that committee did pick the contemporary design for that new building. Okay, so after we get that feedback, then as I mentioned, we go back to the drawing board and make the revisions based on what we heard. And those designs also get further developed as we revise them. So we go from sketches to full Revit BIM modeling in most cases. And the floor plans get more involved and more detailed. You can see that modern exterior design and how that evolved and turned the corner, et cetera. And hand sketches, and this is the Cathedral of Indianapolis once again, become 3D modeled computer drawings. And then those ideas change pretty significant. This evolved a lot over time. This wasn't a dramatic difference between these two meetings, but you can kind of see how it got more and more detailed, and the colors and finishes was a big discussion point. To go from stone to wood was a big decision. And then how does that ramp get integrated so it blends in with the architecture, because ramps are hard at sanctuaries to hide, and that's a common challenge that we have to integrate it in a sensitive way. And then even this elevator addition just didn't change a lot, but developing the exterior paving there to make that a destination in itself before you even go into the building was what came out of that first meeting. And then just how these other projects evolved as well. How does this ramp look behind these cars? I didn't show the ramp, but this view obviously visually conveyed that idea more clearly. And they ended up adding an elevator inside to make the whole building accessible in that case. And on the new church in Kansas, it went from just the church elevation studies to the full master plan studies of how did the other buildings look on the outside now that they were happy with what the church looked like. So we had to kind of do preliminary sketches of the entire campus of what's expanded in that full master plan. In this case, this is a new Coptic Orthodox Cathedral outside of Vancouver, where we went from initial hand sketch to a 3D full Revit model in that initial master planning step for fundraising, and once again to create excitement and build consensus. And then, as I mentioned, we go back and forth, so having those additional meetings to review those again and get more feedback. And then we've, more recently, and since COVID, we've been doing more and more of these online, especially for projects where we're not physically in the city we're working in. And it's been amazing. I mean, I assumed like in Kansas I'd be going there every other month or so, but it was better for them to meet online. As a committee, it was more flexible for them. And Brother John and his group from the Southern Province and the Central Province, Midwest Province of the Dominican Order, this is their group from 2 provinces about the project we're doing in St. Louis. And one unique thing that we did with them was we did an online poll live during a meeting to achieve consensus about a major decision in their building project that related to should each of the bedrooms have a private bathroom, or do we do the dormitory style bathrooms? And in the meeting, we did a live poll basically that helped achieve consensus and help them make the decision for how we should move forward as the architects on the design before the next meeting, which is next Monday. And then the ultimate end at the last design review meeting, okay, which schemes do you want us to do a cost estimate for? That pricing exercise. And typically, or often I should say, we are asked to price 2 different schemes because they're still not quite sure, which scheme might be the best. And at the Cathedral of Indianapolis, we actually priced a scheme that kept the rectory and renovated it and brought it up to current codes and sank a lot of money into to address all the deferred maintenance, or the idea of demolishing that and opening it up and creating this little mini St. Peter's Square at the corner as an entry to the cathedral. So we got full estimates for both of those schemes. And back to that school project, that traditional or modern, they actually even then said, okay, it might be too expensive for us to do this new building. We should price an option to do it as an expansion of our current building. So they asked us to do another little master plan concurrently and then price both options, because this just ended up being way too expensive for that particular parish. And in Kansas, this was just the range of drawings that came from that at the end of those series of design review meetings. Still pretty kind of loose on the exterior, but just enough to convey the materials, and then obviously all the floor plans and more 3D views that the cost estimator could then understand the scope of the project. And this is for my own parish, just some of the renderings we did for the pricing exercise there, and also for fundraising purposes, interior and exterior. And then all of that leads to doing those preliminary cost estimates. But a big important part of that is just doing basic level of engineering so that it's not just a cost per square foot budget estimating, that we typically try to get design, build, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineers to just do basic conceptual estimates. And in some cases for larger projects, we do have consulting engineers do preliminary concepts just so it's a little bit more thorough of a cost estimate from the contractors. And these are just some examples of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing drawings that these particular contractors did for us as part of that process. And for the new church in Kansas, our mechanical engineer did zoning studies, so it says all the zones, and then very traditional MEP concept drawings. And then similar for the civil engineering, just some of the basic grading and utility plans. And just some of the graphics, and in some cases, the engineers help us with the budget estimating. Our civil engineer in this case gave us budget estimates that simplified the cost estimating process. But in more cases, it's typically working with a general contractor that's qualified to do these types of estimates. In this case, for the Cathedral of Indianapolis, Bully & Andrews is a kind of a regional contractor that had an office in Indianapolis, even though they're based in Chicago. And they did these very thorough estimates just based on those drawings that I showed you of floor plans and elevations and 3D models and a lot of question back and forth by email to come up with, and this is one of 15 pages of breakdowns. So these aren't just cost per square foot, budget estimates. They're thorough based on similar building types that they've completed and that we've completed. And we had the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing contractors as well that informed those numbers. And as you see, we had 2 estimates for 2 completely different schemes in this case. So this is like just a brief summary of the numbers. And then talking about phasing. How can this project, not going to be built at one time, what is built in phase 1? And the sequencing that comes from the contractor's input, what's the best way we can achieve this goal over time in a methodical way so we don't have to undo some of the work in phase 2 that was done in phase 1. So that's another reason we really recommend getting contractors involved early, because they can really add a lot to those decisions and conversations.
How do you engage the contractor? Do you pay them? Do they get a contract for pre-construction?
Yeah, so a lot of contractors we worked with are willing to do it kind of on a pro bono basis if they have a chance to build a relationship and are either considered for pre-selection or they just know they have a leg up on their competition if they bid on the project down the road. But we typically encourage our clients to pay them something, for their effort. But I'm amazed at how often they say, no, I won't bill, I want to build a relationship. And in some cases, we work with a cost estimating consultant just to avoid that. So we, in the Kansas case, we actually did both. They initially worked with a contractor that built their school, but then they later, I think I have a slide here. Yes, this is the contractor in Kansas that did an initial estimate, but then they later asked us to have an independent consultant for a later estimate we did during schematic design. So they just weren't comfortable. They thought they were asking the contractor to do too much work, and we agreed that, yeah, it's best to, because they were not, in the end, they did not even get the project either, so it's good they didn't keep asking for estimates from them. And then a big part of the estimates is also all the soft costs that a contractor's not going to estimate. So that's where we come in, we and our design team, so that you have a total project cost estimate instead of just a budget estimate for the hard costs, because they're significant costs. I mean, we've seen as high as, depending on the level of furnishings that are required, as high as 30% of the total project cost can be all the soft costs and owner furnishings. Typically, it's in the 20% range, but it's significant enough that this is a really important part of the cost estimates are all the soft costs. And again, I guess with the theme being consensus building, it's hard to build consensus when you don't have accurate budget estimates that are thorough and complete and with thorough breakdowns. People don't tend to trust just the single line cost per square foot estimates. At least that's what we've learned over the last 20 plus years.
What are you seeing in your region nowadays, the cost per square foot when you do those detailed analysis, where you come in at roughly?
For the traditional Catholic churches, we're in the $400 to $500 a square foot, and
Construction costs or total development with soft?
total in that case. It's more like the 500 range for the total site development and interior furnishings and the building itself. Yeah, so it's significant, and in which case in that particular project, I think there's some slides about it. The first estimate came in at $30 million after we finished schematic. So after the master plan, after schematic design, it's where we further developed with more engineering. It came in at $30 million. Their budget was $20 million. So then that's a whole other discussion about value engineering. But that's our job as architects to design to that budget. And so we had to find creative ways of bringing the numbers down, and we achieved that. It's under construction now. So, okay, so another key part of the process is the broader community, the town hall meetings, or the larger committee meetings with more ministry teams to basically share those ideas that the building committee itself has approved. Well, now it's time to get the input from the broader community, because if they're not involved, how are they, and have a chance to voice their opinion, how are they going to be part of that consensus and agree to whatever the ideas are? So some cases the building committees themselves lead it, but more often than not, we lead it as an independent person. So in that way, it's people feel freer to talk to us and vent to us and ask questions or complain and share their disagreements in some cases. And sometimes the design does change after these town hall meetings. And sometimes we have meetings with the building committee again, like, wow, that was not what we expected. We should rethink this and maybe scale back or add this program element that maybe we didn't get from all the questionnaires. But it's just another really important step that I'm surprised how often different clients of ours don't choose to do this, because we always recommend it and based on our experience, but some cases like, no, we can't do that. That could get out of hand, and we got to keep this simple. And so it's interesting how different clients of ours have handled whether or not to do the town hall meetings. In this case, the town hall meeting was outside in a lawn, and they had a little church services, a little evangelical church that we did design a new church for, and we displayed our design outside, and they had a kind of a town hall meeting outside behind the house that's selling the property for the new church. But it was a very unique town hall meeting style. What's that? Yeah, that's right. It's Front Porch Church, so it was certainly appropriate there. In some cases, like for schools, we'll meet with the student body and share with them, because sometimes there's a few students that are involved, but showing it to the broader school community has also been really helpful, because then they take their feelings to home and they share it with their teachers. So we even think there's a lot of value there to have the student body as part of that process.
At what point does too many stakeholders become diluted?
Right. That's a great question.
What was the question?
At what point does having too many stakeholders dilute the process? I can't say that it's like the biggest one that comes to mind is the Cathedral of Indianapolis. There were stakeholders across the archdiocese. Like it was a whole archdiocese-wide effort and goal. And between the conference calls, and it was hard to keep track of all these groups that they were involving in the process. But it ultimately all came down. It just required more time for us to filter and review and summarize. But it was summarized and ultimately led to a list of goals based on what we heard. So I don't think it was just a little bit more time than it was problematic to have more stakeholders or more groups involved in the process, if that makes sense. But I'll have to think about that one. But that's my gut reaction to the question. I mean, I might change my answer if I think more about it.
If you have too many,
Yeah.
reduced and the bad ideas get better when you have too many people.
Right, right. So yeah, no, that's a good point, because is there a point where you're involving too many, right? Yeah, yeah. So after all of those, so then, the final part of what we do as architects is do the final renderings or issue the final drawings, and to different levels of quality. These were basic renderings that kind of summarize the final design in Indianapolis, the basic computer renderings. But then we also did more thorough computer renderings that were ultimately used for fundraising and sharing the ideas in a more realistic way. And then in some cases, this is kind of the wow rendering. We did a hand watercolor that really sold this idea of the little mini St. Peter's Square on the corner that invites people to the cathedral, as opposed to having a big building that just, it's not a very inviting corner in Indianapolis there. And really captured the design. And in this case, an artisan, DePrato Regali, did this. They were pricing some of the marble for us and stained glass windows, and I had done that little photographic overlay sketch, and they said, oh, we can do a watercolor of that for you. So Regali did this for us to summarize our design of the interior. So that was a great contribution from one of the artisans on our team. And then the church in Kansas, these are just some of the final 3D from those initial sketches we did early on that captured the final design of that master plan. That's in Olathe, Kansas. So yeah, we're going to be this conference is going to be in Kansas City, but on the Missouri side. I said, I think I mentioned to one of the CCFM people last night, we should go over to see. It's going to be finished next April, and it's kind of like Cincinnati here. I was like, that's a different diocese, and I knew that, but anyway, I was hoping we could get a tour of that since it'll be open next year. But anyway, so that's yep.
Use these final renderings to really show off these views and use for fundraising purposes.
Right.
So is there a feasibility study that's been done on the front end to see, does the parish have the capacity to raise the money to do these? Because sometimes these renderings can be beautiful and everything, but yet the capacity of the parish or the community is not there, and they see these and they get disappointed when you have the final
Right.
cutbacks and not be able to present exactly what they saw in these renderings.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. We recommend that they do, but it's another interesting that not every parish or diocese has done those feasibility studies, and that's often a question we ask: is there any budget we need to design toward? Because we hate to design these beautiful buildings and then find out there's no way they can afford it. So we do our best, but it's something that we're taking care of that, or so it's interesting how often, like you said, that happens, and yeah, so we highly recommend it, but in some cases that's kept private from us for some reason, and we don't know. And even if we'll ask, it's like, oh yeah, we can do this, or we can afford this, and in some cases we get these initial estimates like, okay, we love it, but our budget's half that, so how can we achieve part of it and leave the rest as a long-term master plan? So that's where sometimes the phasing comes in, is we still love the overall design, but we can only afford to do that initial phase. So those initial cost estimate breakdowns by phase are what become, the realistic short-term projects with the long-term still in mind, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So on these final, do you include with the cost estimate, landscaping?
Oh yeah, yeah. We kind of the civil engineers typically, some of the ones we work with, have landscape architects on staff too, so that's part of it. Yep. Yep. Yes. Sure. Oh, okay.
We have similar three phases like this instead of one, what we call it, but usually somewhere about 2/3 of the way through that process is when we engage a CM to do the pricing, and at that point is when we usually recommend the parish to bring in a capital campaign consultant, and then that way you have a scope, you have a preliminary budget that CM comes back and helps us get thinking. That's what we call the sweet spot. Is have a little bit of a conceptual design,
Yeah.
some raw numbers, and then take that information with a promotional rendering, and then start campaigning on a low pilot level and see if there's appetite and capacity.
Yeah.
Our diocese does something similar. When we bring on the capital campaign consultant, we have them work with the architect, and the design town hall meetings turn into the capital campaign
Hmm.
town hall meetings
Hmm.
with the zippy renderings that come from the architects, and then those go into the material for the capital campaign. And we take it further in milestone events along the way. The groundbreaking ceremony is
Mhm.
an opportunity for raising funds.
Right.
Excitement about
Yeah, absolutely.
the topping out celebration when
Right.
the project is finishing. It brings new people together to build excitement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing in Kansas they did was they had a right turn lane that they had to build as part of the project, and it was a small standalone project, but just showing any construction progress helped with fundraising because people know, wow, they're doing something. And the Archbishop came, in their case, Archbishop Nowen, who they knew he was retiring, so they knew they had to get him for something before he retired. So it was very interesting, the strategic element of that, of having a groundbreaking just for a right turn lane, even though they used it to do it for the church 6 months in advance of the actual groundbreaking, because the permits were 6 months later. So, but it was very successful and kind of further kickstarting the fundraising. Yep. So again, this is the project in Kansas. After schematic, this actually has even evolved a lot further since here, but these are some of the, and then schematic design master plan phase, interior renderings that we did for fundraising and consensus building. And then again, we did a traditional watercolor of that initial design. So this is the $30 million design. So this had to be simplified a lot after the next more detailed design phase. But the final, in fact, here's the final design. Just a little bit smaller in every dimension, but the same basic design concept. And then here's the final interior design for the most part of that interior there. And they had to end up phasing the build out of, there's a whole lower level parish hall that they needed new offices, but they can hold on the hall and use the current, some of the schools, the former, where they are currently as a church is going to become their hall temporarily. So that was another way we helped get the numbers down, was do partial build out of the lower level, but still the full interior build out of the church itself. So that's why they can still use this rendering for fundraising. And then different views on the inside of this. And then the other church I showed earlier with that ramp here and the reredos. This is one of the designs at the end of schematic design phase. These are the renderings we used there to build consensus and excitement. And then COVID hit. So we had to simplify this even after COVID further. But the broader master plan there, we just did, here these are Revit drawings, but these are just quick hand sketches that we did. And then they have a little new freestanding adoration chapel they want to do at some point. So that was simple enough, we could do that in Revit. So we use different technologies to convey the ideas, basically. We don't do it all one way. And then I do have this particular one, we did the animation of those for fundraising, kind of the walkthroughs, flyovers with the BIM technology and Revit, and then add-on programs. Enscape is one that we use. We can do these much quicker and more efficiently than we used to. It used to be just kind of cost prohibitive, but now because we modeled everything, it doesn't take a ton of effort to then do an animation of it. So on our website, this is just at the bottom, if you went on there, and I have a couple I can show if we have time, but there's some examples there of our animations that we've done for a few of our projects. And again, that's super effective for building consensus. People can visualize it that much more and get excited and therefore support it financially. But we still issue kind of the bound summary of all the documents that we issue, so that there's a record of how the design evolved from the first design review meeting, but also even before that, all the facility assessments, the reserve study, depending on what the extent of the project is, in a bound book or a digital formatted documents. So that's all kind of part of the final deliverables as well. And then, so contractually, typically we had done kind of these simple letter of agreements in the past. The previous president of our firm, wasn't really concerned as much about liability, but as I kind of became a principal and a president of our firm, it started coming up more and more contractual concerns with our liability insurers, and even some of our clients, different dioceses, require AIA contracts. So we use the B102 in Kansas. I think we also used it in Indianapolis, if I remember right. But there's also, if anybody's familiar with the Association of Licensed Architects, so we're members of both, but they have even simpler legal contracts that are prepared by attorneys, but they're simpler and shorter than the AIA contracts. So we've used those on occasion as well, typically for smaller projects, but it's helpful to have kind of a simple legal agreement, at the start of the project, and that ultimately evolves to more detailed agreements, whether it's AIA or ALA. But we still do kind of simple letter of agreements just for the initial, since there's not a lot of liability for master plans initially. These simple letter of agreements still, are acceptable to a lot of our church clients, and dioceses for that matter, in some cases. And then in terms of range of fees, I wasn't planning to show this, but I thought it might be helpful. This has just been kind of our history and how fees have evolved, but it all really depends on the level of service, the number of design review meetings, whether there's a reserve study or facility assessment or not, and whether there's town hall meetings, whether you need animations and 3D renderings. So it's really, quite a range. The one in Kansas that involved cost estimating consultants, preliminary engineering. I mean, we were at $75,000 for the whole process, but most are in the $20,000 to $30,000 range for most of our parish master plans. And then the time frame is also, typically it's 3 months minimum, but in Indianapolis it ended up being like an 8-month process because of a lot of the meetings up front that we mentioned, that to get all those groups involved and get feedback from that initial visioning phase, I think was 2 to 3 months before we even started design. And then we ended up having 4 design review meetings, and then the cost estimating was very thorough. So it ended up being a total of an 8-month process to complete that master plan. What else?
Does that include legal zoning processes if you have to get
No. No, so it just includes our summary of whether a variance will be required, or any challenges code-wise, zoning-wise are kind of summarized. And then that's what this next phase kind of goes into, is this is just one of 5 phases of a traditional design process. But the zoning approval typically is we do during the design development phase. Yep, question? Yeah, great question. So we typically, we want to continue, obviously. I mean, the worst thing is when we do a master plan, then we find out, they hired another architect to do phase 1, or, thankfully that doesn't happen a lot, but it has happened before. But no, our goal is to continue working and for the continuity of the design and the intellectual knowledge and all the documents we produced. But yeah, typically we recommend pre-selecting a contractor early in this design development phase and hiring the full consultant team. That's kind of why I outlined this in these next steps. But we believe it's best to keep the same architect, whoever you're working with. We always think it's the best interest to continue working with them, unless there's just not good chemistry or you're not happy with them, of course. But the beauty of having a standalone contract is you're not overcommitting as a client. You're not getting a full services fee and a full contract and locked into that necessarily, because you don't know necessarily what the design's going to be, what the cost is going to be, hard costs, until you do this initial master plan. And then you might only want to move forward with phase one of that. So then the architect's fees are that much smaller if you're just focusing on one part, but keeping in the long-range master plan in mind. So that architect, and especially if we did the master plan, we know that we can't change the design in a way that impacts that long-range master plan, unless there's really a good reason to modify the master plan, because they do change over time. I mean, it's been interesting to see how long-range master plans, as we do different phases and execute them, the master plan then gets updated along the way. We were talking last night. It was Andrew in Lafayette. We were talking about that exact issue. That updating the master plan should be a requirement of each step of the design process or each phase of a project as you finish it. One of the requirements I thought it was a good comment I think Andrew had, that should be a diocesan requirement to have the architect update that master plan, accordingly, because it might change something that was master planned before you did that first phase. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yep.
Can you go back to the slide prior? Just kind of goes in with question.
Yeah.
You said that in the past the sweet spot for collaboration and committee.
Right.
Our advisors, when we started building committee, we always say the sweet spot's 5 to 7 and 9 at the most. And then when you get down
Yep.
to the stakeholders and the users, we have each one of those building committee members be assigned to that group, whether it's the teachers, the parents, the mission officers. Otherwise, they get unruly. The reason why I say that is your fee here. Thank you for presenting.
Yeah.
Great. They're close in line with what we have in our architect.
Mhm.
The question I have is, when you do one of these levels, level 2, so now the extreme level 3 levels, and you start off with an anticipation of a 2 to 3 to 4 month design process, and then it turns into something that becomes 8 months. What is the fee difference that you see in additional services when we get to that point?
Yeah.
Levels of consensus, and then we bring on more
Right.
orders of voices, and all of a sudden our architect design process is no longer linear and it's more circular or whatever.
Right. Yeah, so we typically include, kind of anticipating that might happen, we typically have kind of a la carte additional design revisions and review meetings, per revision and meeting. We have, I think a number we've used before is like $3,000 for one more meeting with some of the design revisions to prepare for that meeting. And in some cases, we have town hall meetings as another a la carte. Like if you want to have multiple ones, well, another one, later in the process might be another additional fee. So to have that kind of a la carte as things evolve, we think we want to have this alternate design or this additional, town hall or whatever it might be, stakeholder meeting. So we try to allow for that, but it's hard to say, okay, this is the average of how much more fee it is.
Use that example where you had it was 3 months and it turned to 8 months. What the initial fee ballpark was and what it was coming down?
Yeah, I would say it would probably go from the 20 to 30 range, or the 30 to 50 range, depending on the magnitude of the project. If it's a multi-campus, multi-site, like Cathedral of Indianapolis involved, 2 major blocks of the city, and we had to, design and move things and propose things for each of the buildings, not always in 3D, but floor plan wise and program wise, and then do pretty thorough, as you saw, modeling of the key buildings, the cathedral itself and the major additions. But yeah.
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 Most
Right.
finance or parishes or schools, one of the hardest things to do is keep them on track from conceptual design or early programming to the end of this discovery phase or whatever. And, you know, we have to be kind of their person, their
Right.
check and balance.
Right.
A lot of times they want to bring in about as many courses they can, and yet our architects love to explore every option and every option they hear. Our responsibility is to keep people on track and
Yep.
keep them alive. What advice would you give us to help facilitate a linear process so that they don't get sticker shock at the end when they invested $25,000 or $30,000 conceptual design fee, and then somewhere along the line, 5 other small groups all of a sudden have comments, and now we're writing the bill at double or triple what the
Right.
investment is.
Yeah.
They're all in resentment phase because we didn't control them.
Yeah. Well, typically it's what we've advised and what a lot of our clients have done is said, okay, if this is your chance to voice your opinion. Here, you got to do this questionnaire or show up at these meetings. This is your chance. And if you don't show up, then you really can't complain down the road that you don't like what what we're doing. So the structure of this process has helped, I guess, manage that to some degree. But occasionally there have been, we heard from this group and we think we should consider this alternate idea that came up, at the church or parish level. But that's really kind of driven internally. And in some cases, a lot of churches we work at don't have a diocesan, especially some of the Protestant churches, they don't have that overarching. So you bring a lot of value to helping them, helping Catholic parishes, with that process, because otherwise sometimes they do it their own way and they don't control that internally. So I agree. Like Eric Atkins, he just retired, but he was instrumental in helping the rector of the cathedral and his committee kind of stay on track. So you all play a very important role in that. That's really helpful to us as architects, because there's only so much we can do. And it's on us. I mean, we have a set fee. And if we over-design or show too many schemes, that's on us. We don't charge per scheme or per sketch or per rendering. Our goal is to try to build that consensus through our designs to create that excitement. And sometimes we do go too far, and that's something we're struggling with, especially with Revit and BIM. There's a tendency to over-design because you can. And then, so we're struggling with how do we avoid that? Maybe we shouldn't go into Revit right away, just keep it at hand sketches at this initial phase. But so it's something that's continuing to evolve. Yeah. Oh, 20 minutes, okay. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have a ton more slides, but did anybody else have a question about that? Yep.
Over your years, is there a sweet spot in the number of phases you would recommend to have multiple items? Like, a number of years ago at our cathedral, we tried to do this, but
Yeah.
this way, but then it was like 5 or 6 phases.
Yeah, just
After
too
phase
many.
1.5, the whole thing died just for various reasons. So is it better to keep it to a 2 or 3 phase so it's more realistic financially and accomplishing?
Yeah.
Or, I mean,
Yeah, we have tried to limit it to like 3 phases, just realistically. But then you have the full, if it's got a full reserve study or facility assessment, that's almost like all the maintenance kind of becomes they do it progressively as the different building projects are completed. But that's kind of not really a phase, but just something that's there for the parishes to then keep track of and keep chipping away at while they build out these improvements. But yeah, 3 is typically the max that we show. I can't remember when we've shown one that's more than 3 phases. Like I think all the examples I showed were 3 phases, in fact.
if it's over
Yeah.
3, then how many years?
Right.
If
Yeah.
it's 2, 3, 4 years, your price is up.
Right. Yeah, and we always have those escalation factors, which, the estimators that worked with on a couple of these, they were using 5% per year. We had traditionally used 3%, but we always defer to the contractors we're working with or cost estimators because they know much more about where the industry's going. And yep.
When you're doing basic budget estimating, obviously you've got numbers in mind. You're trying to maybe
Good question.
I can probably help answer it.
Yeah.
A lot of times the MEP is what ends up.
Yeah. The mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. Yeah.
Because that's overall in a construction budget, and your MEP is in the 20-something% range of the overall building. So as far as foundations and steel, I mean, we can track that, right, cost percentage. But when it comes to mechanical systems, that gets tricky because we're talking about big spaces that have very extended use, and engineers have to design it to a certain code, whether it's half full or church is completely full.
That's also why we really try to get MEP contractors, at least, if not consulting engineers. But we prefer the contractors if you know they're available and interested and have a chance of actually doing the project. Because yeah, that's the most important. That's typically what 30% of the total price is in the MEP systems, right?
Systems and things like that early on.
Conceptual, yeah. I showed an example of like that was a smaller project, but they did mechanical, electrical, plumbing concepts and budget estimates that went with those. And as design build contractors, they take ownership of that. So they can't, you know, do a change order to themselves, you know what I mean? Because if they're hired to be the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing contractors, they have to kind of, you know, design accordingly so that they don't underdesign or overdesign early on. Right.
Versus a chiller system and costs,
Yeah.
It's VRF.
Yeah.
Well, what we see is that the big design escalator is early in the project, civil. We can get the civil
Mhm.
involved early in when you have such design, you're gonna know whether on-site and off-site improvements are gonna be, and it's amazing what that does get accommodated to the budget. There are also physical stuff that have to do with fixing roads, intersection, crosswalks, adding turning lanes, that could add anywhere from $500,000, yeah, to have $1 million plus on the project. And then again, MEP, if you drill down into the two big drivers, the type of system using, whether it's still on the central plant or gets packaged, put in, and then at the tail end of design, where the biggest sticker shock is your electrical. It's gonna be your lighting consultant and how crazy they want to go with your package as far as your lighting usage. So you just have to figure out when the spikes are during your design, figure early in the process, civil and mechanical, and then about halfway through design down, it's gonna be a much more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, you know, specific to lighting design, I agree. So the new church in Kansas, we had the full team of engineers and consultants, including audiovisual, acoustical, lighting design. So there's some of those specialty consultants that sometimes are overlooked in the schematic design phase. Were pivotal to having early on. And that's why that fee was in the 75 range, because they agreed, the building committee and the diocese agreed that that was prudent to do that and get that information early so that they knew where the cost was going to be. Because the light, especially lighting, that's one that we're particularly sensitive to. Like, no matter how beautiful a church, if it's not lit well, if you don't have a good lighting designer, it's not going to be a successful design. And that's something that's often overlooked, and we have to explain a lot of how important that is. And it's beyond our ability as architects. It's really an art in itself. So we have a go-to lighting designer that's very artful at that. Yeah. Anyway, okay. What else? Oh, so here's a more simple, from a percentage standpoint, for each of those phases of the full design process. And again, this initial master plan schematic design phase typically is in the 10 to 15% range of the full project percentage in terms of the level of our services. And with Revit, that's kind of been growing. We've been shifting our fees a little bit more from construction documents, and just because of the amount of time to build the model and input all the information, there are more detailed drawings earlier with the introduction of BIM over the last 10 plus years in our case.
One of the things that we like to do in the Archdiocese in Miami is when we hire an architect to do a master plan and schematics, when I negotiate that architect's fees, I ask and make sure that I get a credit from the architect.
Right, for the master plan.
For basic services, if I just hire
Right.
service, then I say when I negotiate your basic services,
Yep.
I want to get a credit back on the schematic.
Absolutely. And that's always a line item in our estimates. You credit the applicable portion, because the visioning and, you could argue as an architect that that's not a part of a traditional basic services.
Right.
So we always negotiate like what part of that master plan fee is really schematic design and what part is kind of additional. But yeah, that's a great point. And what else? Okay, so I'm at the end. This is just the final, the whole goal of all of this obviously is to achieve the beauty of the buildings that you're building, the chapels or churches you're building. And this is just one. I didn't show other renderings of this, but this is Relevant Radio's new headquarters chapel outside of Chicago. This is a radio studio. They televise Mass every day online. They're worldwide now. But anyway, this is a brand new photograph that we just got in the last few weeks here. Yeah, anybody else have any other questions? Yep.
Talk about when you're doing the master planning and laying out the parking lots. Are you using code or using your experience, or how many stalls do you end up?
Yeah, so laying out parking lots. So yeah, we have to provide the parking per the zoning analysis that we do during the master planning process. And in some cases, if a civil engineer is involved, they'll do a more detailed, circulation drawings, not just the parking, but turn lanes and, making sure it meets the fire access requirements for radius of the fire trucks getting to every part of the site that they need to get to. But conceptually, some of those early design, before we get the engineers involved, we'll do basic, site plans showing how we can accommodate all the parking that's required for the particular project.
More specifically, asking about code requires this amount.
Right.
What is your experience saying, well, do I
It's-
recommend code, do I recommend a percentage?
No, it's very rare that we can meet code with parking, as many of you probably know. That's typically a variance. Like, there's just no way. There's not enough. And then also the impervious requirement for impervious paving and stormwater drainage. It's hard to meet both requirements for site design. So that's typically a challenge, especially for significant additions to churches or new churches, to meet the zoning requirements. And that's one of the things we identify up front is like, we're gonna have to get a variance for one of these as part of the process, and we have to allow for that fee-wise, time-wise, and hold on going too far with the design until we get that zoning approval. So that's part of our job, is to inform our client of that step if that's going to be a challenge to the project. Yep. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Two questions. First one is, I guess, what is your favorite part in the master plan process as an architect working with communities and parishes? The second question is, if you can name maybe 2 or 3 things as far as like tips that would help the owners for a successful master plan, obviously from the architect's perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, my favorite part, people say, other architects, how do you work with churches? Why do you work with churches? They don't understand the frustration of working with building committees. And Bill, I love the challenge of building consensus, and I love working with different personalities and finding a way to do exactly that, build the consensus between the different people that have different backgrounds and represent different interests. Of course, the design as an architect, especially if it's a new traditional Catholic church, that's my passion. So I love developing, our designs for new Catholic churches, especially. But I love all building types too. So yeah, of course, the schematic design, conceptual design is for me the most enjoyable, and the back and forth with the building committees. And I don't love town hall meetings. I'm not a big group presentation person, but it's part of our job, and it's necessary and important, but I'd much prefer the smaller group presentations and design discussions than the large group format, personally. And then in terms of the different things I'd recommend, I feel like, I'm just curious to get any feedback anybody wants to provide, like how we've kind of synopsized this into these 3 steps. I do recommend this approach. I'm not saying it's the only approach, but this is just what works for us. and we've had many successful projects evolve out of this. I mean, the project in Kansas, the fact that it's getting built, and it's not a wealthy community, but the excitement that's been generated by this process and the renderings, and it's really kind of helped us to see that this process works when it's done properly. Even though that initial fee was higher, I think that may be one of the recommendations. Is I wish I had recommended more to some of our previous master plans, including Indianapolis Cathedral, that maybe we should have gotten more of the consulting input there that we got in Kansas. So, but I'm always concerned about, we got to keep our fee, meet their budget for the fee. But so I'd recommend being a little bit more open to spending a little bit more fee on preliminary engineering and lighting design specialty consultants early on than maybe in the past. That's one thing I've learned recently, is that's really been helpful on a few of our recent master plans, that we got the approvals for additional consultants beyond ourselves. Yeah. You're seeing that yourself? Yeah. 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 Yes, sir. Oh. 5 minutes? Okay.
In hindsight, was that over budget project where you had to go back to the drawing board? What's the biggest thing that steered you back to $10 million over budget?
I think it was a combination of the first estimate was from a contractor that maybe hadn't built a church like this before, that was traditional, and very traditional outside and inside. But it was also a full masonry building. And so we went from full masonry to metal stud with full masonry on the front facade only, to masonry base, but ephes. I hate ephes, but it has it's come a long way. It's drainable now. It doesn't, but we had no choice but to simplify the masonry on the less visible sides or less prominent sides of the building to get the budget down. But we had to shrink in every dimension. We had to eliminate a dome. They love the dome, but what we did instead of the dome outside was just a false dome inside. So we have a ley light, circular, large stained glass window over the sanctuary that captures that idea on the inside, but they didn't need it necessarily on the outside because they have two little towers. So they had to let go of some things that they loved initially but weren't necessary for the space and the liturgical experience itself. The dome wasn't required. Yeah. What did we lose time-wise? Yeah, it wasn't ever put on hold. It's still kind of, they never had like a drop-dead time that they had to complete construction. I'd say they originally wanted to be complete by December of 25, and it's going to be Easter of 26 instead of Christmas of 25, because of some of the value engineering that we had to go through to get from 30 to 20, and then they upped it to 22 with the diocese's approval. So yeah, that's probably translated to a 4-month difference. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So there was a appreciate the presentation. My question is about cost. Specifically, there's the cost estimation from GC or from MEP, depending on how detailed the project gets. But what about the impact of life cycle costing? Things like sustainability. Whose responsibility is that?
Yeah.
Which hat is the one best equipped?
Yeah, we found the architects, us, and then the mechanical engineers with the systems, and because sustainable design is kind of integral to what we do now. Very few churches want the actual accreditation for LEED Gold, LEED Silver, et cetera. But we've had a few that want that, but typically it's like, are you designing towards Laudato Si? And yes, we believe in that, and so therefore we recommend solid masonry buildings over metal stud and ephes, but sometimes they can't afford it. That's the biggest challenge, is rarely can our churches afford truly the building, I guess, materials and systems that are truly have a longer life cycle, and that's challenging. But yeah, okay. But we try to find the balance of all that. If that makes sense. But I'd say the mechanical engineers are probably the key of those energy recovery units as energy savers, and then the the window systems, of course, all the exterior envelope elements that we're primarily always thinking about. Is this the best within the budget that we can provide and still achieve the budget? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'll add to that. When, in our diocese, in order to put the shovel on the ground, the parish needs to present to the diocese, and they provide a 10-year cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
So the additional cost of utilities and maintaining the facilities, those kind of things are factored in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because sometimes it's a large addition to a
Right.
small parish.
Yeah.
And they don't account for that additional staff that is going to
Yeah.
require, so that 10-year cash flow.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, because this project in Kansas, we had a chiller-based mechanical system that was very expensive, but required less maintenance. Well, now they have rooftop units because it was much more affordable, but they know that they're going to have more maintenance costs, and those units are going to be replaced much sooner. But they just couldn't afford the full chiller-based system. But that they decided, well, this is to get to the 22 million from 30. That was one of the changes they had to make. And it's less energy efficient. So they had to kind of let go and just accept that this is the reality. To get this church, they had to make some tough decisions like that. Yeah, it's a great point. So
All right,
that's
I
it.
wanna Thank you. I'm going to come up here and make it
Yeah,
sound pretty
yeah.
loud, but I'm
Okay.
don't want anyone to miss this. Thank you. We want to thank David. If you could give him a round of applause, please. Especially since you said it's not your favorite thing to present to larger groups, so we appreciate it.
Hopefully that wasn't obvious.
No, it was all good. It was great. So your next move is going to be to the Covington Ballroom in the Marriott for your networking lunch. But please make sure that you have signed in. If you have not signed in, please do so. And we do need your evaluation forms. If you have it filled out already, you could just put it on this black table right near. Yep, if you didn't do the sign-up sheet, it's right here. If your evaluation form is filled, you can put it right there next to the water cooler. And if you haven't had time to do it yet, there are 2 places on the registration desk where you could turn it in. Thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.